Now we're going to leap into the beginning of our discussion. I'm going to introduce very briefly, not because I don't love her, but because she and her panelists and everyone here who will be up here has a bio both in the Wordle on their name tag and in the brochure that you have. So I'll only say two things about her. We were really fortunate to wrestle her away from MIT. And she is the person who launched the very first TEDx conference, the TED, using the TED name to do something off campus, off the TED conference, and it was so successful that it has spawned how many around the world? 1,600. So she did it here first. Please welcome, and if she and her panelists could take the stage, Zee Holly.
Thank you so much, Marty, for that kind introduction. And what we're going to be talking about today is innovative research communities. And why is that? Well, I'd like to just say a couple words. If you go back about 10,000 years, a very important thing happened in humankind. We settled in cities. And what did that mean? It led to a watershed moment where we really started as humans to invent. And it was really, sure, before that, you know, we might have had a few tools here and there, but it took 30,000 years for us to go from mining to metallurgy. And it wasn't until we ended up being in close proximity to each other that ideas bounced off of each other and built on each other that we were able to come up with things like bread and aqueducts and the alphabet and rulers and cement and writing and wheels. And so it really is that importance of that community to bring people together and the ideas together. And if you fast forward to the Renaissance, markets evolved from a hierarchical, feudal system to a more networked society, a free market economy. And it was based on that new inventions and new ideas started to flow even more. One great example I like to give is what Goethe had described as one of the finest inventions of the human mind, double entry bookkeeping. No one person takes credit for it, but it was critical for capitalism. But it's actually something that's been shared and was created from the bouncing of these ideas from people to people in that networked economy. And so clearly the interplay of people and their ideas is a really critical piece of innovation, as we all know. But today we're at the edge of a new revolution, and due to technology this time, it enables us to collaborate in ways that we've never seen before. And that's the good news. And the bad news is it enables us to collaborate in ways that we've never seen before. And so it's a positive opportunity. I'm very excited, and we're all very excited about seeing where it's going to go. And what I'd like to do in today's panel is to define innovative research communities and explore some examples, discuss the opportunities and challenges in getting people to collaborate in novel ways in academia, and also to help identify some best practices and opportunities for further innovation. So I have three amazing panelists that have really fantastic backgrounds in this, and I'll have each one of them give just a few words for context so that we know what it is that they've been working on. So we have Carl Kesselman, who's a professor of industrial and systems engineering and a fellow at ISI in the Viterbi School of Engineering. And his current research interests include health informatics and all aspects of grid computing. And he's also been a real leader in exploring collaboration tools. We also have Neil Buchholz, chief of the Dementias of Aging branch at NIH's National Institute on Aging, and he'll tell you about a remarkable new program that he's leading over there, which really enabling people to collaborate in ways that we've never seen before across the globe. And Catherine Rowe, who teaches and writes about literature and media change, and among many things, she's been a real pioneer in her role piloting a new open publishing model at Shakespeare Quarterly, and I think that she's probably the one who's come the farthest from just outside of Philadelphia. So please welcome our panel. So, Carl, why don't you start?
So I guess I get to kick off the day here. So along the topic of innovative research communities, I'm going to start with a global example, and I'm going to bring this down kind of local to USC as I get to the end. So my example is around 10 years ago, we started doing some work with the people who are building this very expensive hole in the ground outside of Geneva called the Large Hadron Collider. And this is a global community of scientists, and the LHC is a large scientific instrument that actually had multiple communities of scientists built around it. There are 3 or 4 experiments that are actually inside that are running off the collider. And the problem that they faced is they were generating tremendous amounts of data, which required tremendous amounts of analysis that had to take place on the data, and literally a global community of scientists that were collaborating. And if you think driving from UPC to Health Sciences campus is difficult, I know I did that yesterday, flying to Geneva to do your work was even more complex. And what they ended up doing was something quite interesting that here at USC, myself and a colleague of mine had been developing something that we were calling grid computing, which was infrastructure to facilitate collaboration. I'll talk about the types of collaboration in just a moment. And what ended up happening was LHC ended up building a global informatics infrastructure that facilitated collaboration across these communities and experiments and data sharing and results sharing. Now, the important thing that I think differentiates the types of communities that were set up, and we coined a term, actually it turns out we appropriated a term called virtual organizations that is used to describe these kinds of communities. But what was important is that what you want to share in these communities is not just web pages and communication, like I'm sure we're all familiar with, but that you're sharing process, you're sharing computation, you're sharing services, you're sharing data, you're sharing scientific instruments. And you need to do these, going back to the organizational setting, with business rules and processes and policy and provenance in place. So it's not just the production of the data. It's not just somebody saying, well, this is true because I read it on the internet, but actually being able to trace it back, figure out the veracity of that data, understand the fact that there could be conflicting views of that data. What is, the fact that truth is just my perspective of whether I assume this to be correct and how I can trace that back. So we ended up building this infrastructure to support the creation of these virtual communities. And it's turned out that these ideas of virtual organizations and infrastructure to create these virtual communities has really kind of taken off. And if you look at a lot of the work that's now currently funded out of the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, and so on, you see now this kind of fairly pervasive adoption of the notion of how do I create virtual organizations and communities, and more importantly, how do I build a persistent, reusable infrastructure that's not domain or community specific to support these types of collaboration. So the idea, if you want to support the dynamic, adaptive, exploratory types of research and scholarship that we want to do, you can't build kind of a one-off, integrated, one-size, sole purpose-built system and expect that to support the diversity of the types of scientific investigation you want to do. And as I said, issues of dynamics, provenance, policy are all important in this. And so I think this represents a really interesting form of new kind of creative collaborative scholarship. Now to bring it local, I should point out at the beginning of the day today, there were a couple examples given of new collaborative science types of activities. And as you may know, here at USC, we recently won a large award from the NIH around these CTSI. And one of the things that we're doing as part of the infrastructure of the CTSI is applying these types of virtual collaboration rather than purpose-built single database data format that only I can understand, the provenance of the information is only in my lab notebook, to build out a persistent shared infrastructure across the university to support these types of virtual dynamic collaborations as part of what we're doing within the CTSI.
Thank you. Neil, if you could tell us a little bit about how you're enabling this type of collaboration to happen.
Sure. If I could have this slide. So basically what I'd like to talk to you about for a few minutes is the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, or ADNEY, which I think really is a revolutionary study in the clinical neurosciences for collaboration and data sharing. ADNEY was conceptualized in the early 2000s based upon discussions that I'd had with scientists in the pharmaceutical industry who were starting to develop or think about developing drugs that would actually affect disease modification in Alzheimer's disease. But there were really no good ways of measuring that. The clinical and neuropsychological measures that were used really couldn't differentiate between a disease-modifying effect and a symptomatic benefit. So the idea was that perhaps through biological measures of brain function, that methods could be developed to look at whether a particular drug actually affected the disease process in the brain. So ADNEY was set up to collect data and samples to establish a brain imaging biomarker and clinical database, to determine optimal methods of acquiring, processing, and distributing images and biomarkers. There are 57 clinical sites in the United States and Canada that are collecting and sending data to various places, to validate imaging and biomarker data by correlating them with the neuropsychological and clinical data. And I want to focus on this last piece, rapid public access of all data and access to samples. So if I can have the next slide, but I basically want to do, it's a lot of words, but I wanted to give you a feel for the amount and kinds of data that are in the database, because there are tremendous amounts of data, various domains of data that people can access. So there are three groups of subjects: a group of people with mild Alzheimer's disease, a group of normal cognitive aging elder individuals, and a group of people with what we call mild cognitive impairment. This is a transitional phase between normal cognitive aging and Alzheimer's disease in which there's a memory deficit, but in general, other cognitive domains are intact, but these people are at very high risk of progressing to Alzheimer's disease. So the idea was to follow these groups of people over time with a variety of different measures and see which measures were best at following the disease progression. So everybody gets clinical and neuropsychological evaluations. Everyone gets a magnetic resonance imaging scan to look at the structure of the brain. And subsets of individuals get FDG PET, which is a measure of glucose utilization in the brain, to look at energy metabolism. Blood is collected. There is a sub-study of a new PET ligand called Pittsburgh compound B, which now allows us to look at the amount of amyloid in the brains of living individuals. Amyloid is associated with the plaques that are seen in Alzheimer's disease. So this is now a way, again, in living individuals to look at this pathophysiological signature of Alzheimer's disease and follow it over time. Cerebrospinal fluid is collected from 50% of subjects, and there's a genetic analysis, a genome-wide association study that's been done on everyone, and studies of proteins in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid. So I mentioned these are for 36 months, but actually we've gotten funding to follow these people as well as new cohorts over 5, 6, and even 7 years. So there's a tremendous amount of data in the database, more data than any group by itself could really ever analyze. So the idea from the beginning was to provide rapid public access of all the raw and processed data, no special access. So even though this is a public-private partnership, the private partners consisting of pharmaceutical companies, imaging manufacturers, diagnostic companies, in the first phase of ADNEY put in $24 million to NIH's $40 million. Nobody gets special access to the data. Everyone gets the data at exactly the same time, and the data are put in basically in real time. So as the data are collected, they go into the database and people can access the data. All they have to do is sign a data use agreement. So the data use agreement simply says that I agree to acknowledge ADNEY in my publications in a specified way. So the threshold for getting a password to get into the data is very low. And essentially anyone whose name is not Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck can basically get into the database analyze all the data, write papers based on the data, and publish the papers. And all of these data are freely available. The databases are at the University of California, the Laboratory of Neuroimaging, again, in the public domain, available to all qualified investigators. There are samples, the blood and cerebrospinal fluid are available for sharing. And the only thing that the Data Publication and Sharing Committee looks at is whether ADNEY is recognized appropriately in the publication. They don't do any kind of scientific review. So there was a lot of discussion at the very beginning, what if people come up with different results? Well, that's what happens, but you have the data in the database. You can go back and check the calculations. You can do whatever you want. So I always come back at the end to something that Artoga said. Artoga is the head of the informatics core at the Laboratory of Neuroimaging, and that is that through ADNEY, any scientist sitting anywhere at his or her computer, anywhere in the world, day or night, can go into the ADNEY database, can download any of these data, can analyze the data however they want, with whatever novel ways that they have, whatever hypotheses, and then can publish the data freely. And that this is really a tremendous advance for the whole neuroscience community.
Thank you very much. And although it may seem so far that it's only used for science, these sort of innovative new ways of collaboration can also be used in other disciplines as well. So Catherine, please tell us what you're doing.
Thanks. I'm going to be talking from the journal editor's perspective about generating an innovative community of scholarly reviewers. But I want to sort of highlight two things I've just heard from Neil and Carl. One is that it's never, the challenges and the opportunities of using new technology in innovative ways are rarely about the tools themselves. They're mostly about the human behaviors. And I want to go back to Randy's example of the typewriter and remind you of Mark Twain's experience, one of the early adopters of new writing technologies. He claimed to be the first person to write a novel on a typewriter. So he's the precursor of Randy's last person to write a dissertation on the typewriter. But famously, when he bought his first typewriter, had a terrible experience with it. He thought it was going to make his writing much more efficient and take less time. And in fact, the opposite happened. Hundreds of people wrote to him saying, please send me a letter back written on a typewriter. So that the desire for completion that the typewriter seems to represent to us now is something that we learned to acquire, to make happen on a typewriter. So we're at a moment, like Twain was in that early adoption phase, needing to learn how to make these tools answer our needs as scholars. And that's the question that's most exciting, it seems to me, in grappling with what makes innovation work. The second thing that I want to echo from what we're hearing right now is that many of the problems that we think of as most challenging and exciting intellectually are ones that we can't grapple with in small groups or as individual scholars. And that was true with a particular problem in Shakespeare studies that Shakespeare Quarterly was focusing on when we decided to experiment with a mode of open peer review. We were looking at the interdisciplinary topic of Shakespeare in new media, and as a field, Shakespeare Studies doesn't have we have a growing expertise in media history, but the kinds of questions that we're grappling with require us to reach out into statistical analysis and out into social science practices that aren't native to us and to our vetting processes. So we're talking in many cases about arenas of knowledge that require expansive models of scholarly collaboration. They cannot be solved without it. What was novel about how Shakespeare Quarterly went about experimenting with peer review was first that the board of a very traditional humanities journal understood itself as obligated to take on that experiment in its own processes. We opened the scholarly vetting phase to a public process where reviewers were named, scholarly reviewers were named, and opted in. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. We did that in advance of the publication decision. There have been a number of experiments with various modes of open pre-publication issuing at scientific journals and humanities journals. We did this before the publication decision was made, and the phase of review that we made it public was the phase of vetting. We came up with a hybrid process that achieved a critical mass of scholarly participants. That's also new. That's seen as one of the kind of critical challenges in public vetting. How do you get enough people who are willing to come and speak frankly, and that will provide an editorial team or an editor with feedback of the quality and sufficient quantity to make a publication decision? What was novel about our outcomes were that the publication decisions were based on a group of experts and the push and pull between them, rather than on the traditional 2 data points of anonymous expert review. There was a peer-to-peer effect in which the editors could begin to see where the field itself was grappling with problems that hadn't yet been solved, as opposed to where a particular author might not be successfully grappling with a problem. And that peer-to-peer effect among the reviewers and with the authors as they responded to each other and grappled with particularly difficult issues allowed us as editors to make decisions that were, in a way, accountable to the field as a whole, rather than accountable to the 2 reviewers that we might traditionally be looking to vet essays. For an interdisciplinary topic, that was crucial. We could not have, I think, made as successful an editorial decision without the wider net of the 41 participants that we were able to draw in to vet the 4 essays under consideration. And we were able to gain some clarity as editors about the significance of these essays. In particular, 2 of them brought significantly new methodologies to the field, new methodologies to the journal itself. And without a group vetting of this kind, on the model of something like one would see in a grant review panel in the sciences, I don't think we could have seen the significance as well as the challenge of those new methodologies. I think that's enough by way of introduction. Oh, yes, and I was going to show you very quickly a screenshot of our platform for doing this. Thank you. Our collaborator in this project was Media Commons, and my partner in putting this together was Kathleen Fitzpatrick of Pomona. Many of you know her and her study, Planned Obsolescence, her study of changing scholarly modes of publication. So if you'll just drill down here, I'll give you an example of how this platform, it's a comment press environment that allows paragraph by paragraph, oops.
Sorry.
That's okay. Paragraph by level commenting on essays. And we're going to drill down into Alan Gailey's essay there and look at the very end of it, where there was a long push and pull about what the larger stakes of this essay were. Thanks. We set up both paragraph-level commentary and summative commentary of the kind that a journal editor wants to be able to see from an expert reviewer. And you can see here, I hope, both the kind of clustering of comments, that effect that gave a peer-to-peer review of the reviewers, and how substantive and direct in criticism the reviewers felt they could be. All right, that's enough. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Really impressive, and what a range of applications for these innovations. And I'm wondering, maybe I can ask a bit of a provocative question, is what are the, let me put it this way, do scholars actually want to collaborate?
So let me respond. If we can assume that scientists are a subset of scholars, I can speak from the scientific perspective. There are classes of problems for which aggregation of information and collaboration is essential to making progress. So there's sometimes what we call big science. I think that ADNEY is an example that it's only by the accumulation of enough data points can you make the scientific advance, and collaboration is essential to making that happen. So there are, we see increasingly, Tom Jordan will talk about that I think this afternoon also a little bit. SCEC is another good example where it's physically impossible to make the advance without collaborating, sharing data, aggregating enough data, because you just don't see enough events otherwise.
We know spinach is good for us, but not everybody likes spinach. So do we feel, are there barriers, social barriers to this? And tell us a little about
Well, there are. I mean, I think an interesting contrast is to ADNEY. We've done a lot of work with LIGO, which is a gravity wave observatory. Now, in that case, the memorandum of understanding had very strict rules about what you could and could not publish, because what they didn't want was somebody to say, we've discovered a gravity wave, only to turn out that, no, we haven't discovered a gravity wave. So you need to accommodate these kind of social norms and processes, and if you discover a gravity wave, you get a Nobel Prize. Who gets to get the prize? So you do have to accommodate that, and the interesting thing is the infrastructure then needs to support those types of processes and policies in how you support the community.
I think it's, in ADNEY at the beginning, there was a lot of discussion for this very issue. I mean, so what happens if somebody publishes something and it's wrong? Well, that's what happens when you go into this mode. But overall, it's a much better way to do it than, I was thinking this morning about the traditional way of doing these kinds of larger clinical studies, such as epidemiological studies. You recruit subjects. A couple years later, you write some kind of baseline paper about what the subjects look like. Then, 3 or 4 years later, you write another paper on the first results, and then just the people who are involved in the study get access to the data, and it's a very complicated process. But, this really just opens up the whole thing. Opens up to whoever wants to look at the data and has a good idea. And it can't be done in all cases, but in some cases where you have a problem that really can't be solved without this kind of collaboration and getting new ideas, I think it's an interesting way to think about it.
I'll respond to the kind of sort of human question that you're asking there, which is, I think at least in the humanities, many of us don't want to collaborate. Many of us come into the field because we love going into a quiet room and working with objects that stay the same from century to century, and the contemplative, the meditative, the long arc of coming to knowledge. Dana Poland has called the experience of reading in this mode. I'm going to mangle what he says. He describes it as a kind of sustained engagement that we deeply value, and that we usually do alone. So in the reactions of the participants, the reviewer participants in our experiment were really striking in this respect. I told the editorial board to expect about half of us maybe who committed in advance. I corralled a group of scholars who would be among the ones we would normally send these essays to for expert review to agree to participate in advance. But I said to everybody, we're guessing maybe half of us will really find we can do it. And we're willing to do it. And that was about the number that it turned out to be. For some of us, reviewing publicly, vetting an essay publicly with other people effectively looking over our shoulders is a tremendously uncomfortable experience. For others, as I learned, others of us don't, in principle, review anonymously. And they found it much easier to adopt. And actually, I have shifted my own mode since this experiment and sort of gave myself a time frame for testing what it feels like never to review anonymously for several years. But it is a change in human practice, given that many of our institutional structures encourage solo work. It attracts personalities who like solo work, and to shift to recognize the the essential need to collaborate is really an individual as well as an institutional struggle.
Are there specific decisions that any of you had to make or now wish you had made that really would influence the way people collaborate? You've talked about anonymity, for example. What are some of the things that we might consider?
Naming reviewers was essential. Non-anonymity in this particular mode of scholarly peer review was essential. We came to it because I spoke with a number of junior scholars who were considering participating, and an early concern for the board was, what are there differential consequences for people who are already tenured than for junior scholars and graduate students in participating in a process like this? And what the junior scholars said is, look, we could live with being publicly turned down, but we need to know, to be able to show if we're reappointed, that experts reviewed our work. And that's understood to be part of Shakespeare Quarterly's review process. It's guaranteed in the anonymous mode. We need some way to attest to that in a public mode. But the result of that was when you carry your reputation with you wherever you go, you behave accordingly. And so the result of that was a tremendously respectful set of exchanges, though critical. And the initial anxiety that we would develop trolls and other kinds of dysfunctional community behaviors online didn't pan out.
Did you want to add anything?
I'd just like to comment. I mean, we're hearing a lot of what are essentially kind of endpoints in the collaboration spectrum. And I think it's really important to realize that this spectrum exists and it's not an either-or decision. I think if one thinks about this from the perspective that they're absolutes in terms of anonymity or lack of anonymity or openness of the data or control of the data, that you end up in some extent, you end up in a situation where we're today with the internet, where you get all kinds of spam and you have no idea where information came from, and all kinds of bad things happen. So I think as we move forward in supporting these communities, I think from an infrastructure and technology perspective, it's important to understand this spectrum and the need to support a variety of social and collaboration processes, and to build the ability to have that in there. And I go back to this. I mean, and you see, and it's a combination of both social and technical. So if you look at Wikipedia, they've ended up building this fairly intricate social governance structure on top of well, maybe that's the right way to do it, but you could also imagine that there would be technology solutions, alternate versions of articles. How do you trace back the veracity of who made the comment? Was it, the individual? What is an expert? Who considers whom to be an expert? So it's not necessarily up for the system or the infrastructure to decide who the expert is and what's true and what's not true, but to provide the structure so that the individual can filter and apply the information that they view as meaningful, and also to support the notion of traceability and repeatability and so on. That's part of the scientific process.
So one of the things you brought up was you mentioned the Nobel Prize, and I'm wondering, how is it that you can recognize contributions in such a highly collaborative model? Because it's really we're talking about a whole other can of worms here.
I mean, it's interesting. If you read a physics paper, they have like 100 authors on it.
I actually heard that if they actually do find the Higgs boson, that nobody can get the Nobel Prize because there'd be too many people, and they can't give the Nobel Prize to that many people. I don't know if that's true.
Well, I'm sure it'll probably be the person who runs the experiment that finds it, but this goes back down to the reward mechanism and how you attribute contributions. In physics, it's quite common to see papers with hundreds of authors on them, and that's kind of expected. And if you have a paper that has 100 authors on it and it's the right experiment, I think that's good enough to get tenure.
I'd flip it over and say it's worth...
Sorry, all 100 people.
It's worth remembering that our traditional processes don't manage to accredit labor either successfully. And the most crucial arena in that respect right now is the reviewing itself, which happens nearly invisibly. Kathleen Fitzpatrick has written at some length about this, that we don't, our scholarly economy depends on a kind of gift economy of significant labor that this room does, peer reviewing other people's work. And we don't currently have a very robust way for crediting that labor. We didn't come up with a better way in Shakespeare Quarterly. We ultimately wanted to incorporate a number of the threads of commentary in the print version of the journal, but it would have required us to buy an extra signature, and that was too expensive. So the limitations of print there got in the way of finding a way to formally credit some really important interventions by reviewers. At least they're visible now in an archive. But I do think one of the places that we as academics need to innovate is in thinking about how we credit the work of reviewing and how we count that work in reappointment decisions and other kinds of goods in our field.
With respect to ADNEY, I mean, the papers are authored by specific individuals, but then it says, and the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, and in some place, either in the paper or in a website, the names of the individuals who contributed to the ADNEY database. The scientists are available. So it is a problem, I think, especially for young investigators in terms of the issue of how to get credit for these kinds of things. But if they author the papers, then it's still the first. The first author is still something that's actually looked at, or the last author in terms of the major authors of the paper.
I'll throw it out to the audience for questions in 1 second, but I just wanted to flip it on its head and say, well, what things have we learned either from the physical space that are now being transformed into the virtual space? I mean, the water cooler, how are we recreating that? And on the flip side, what are we learning in virtual communities that we might be able to use in the physical space? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, we still get together, I should say. I mean, there's still meetings, at least twice a year of this group, for example. So people still do like to get together physically and talk to each other and see what's going on. So I think that's still important. It's not just a virtual group of people who meet on the internet. It's physical interactions that I think really are, and conference calls. I mean, there are many, many, many conference calls as well where people interact directly. So I do think that's important as well in terms of keeping the thing going.
I guess I would agree with that and go back to Carl's point that we're looking at a spectrum and that we move between physical spaces like this and virtual spaces, and there's a remarkable amount of traffic in behaviors, in social protocols between virtual environments and face-to-face ones. So we saw a lot in our reviewing pool, a lot of people behaving the way Michelle Lamont describes grant reviewers on panels behaving, developing their own internal vocabulary, protocols, establishing their criteria through disagreements with each other. And my assumption is that that's because we've learned those behaviors face-to-face. They weren't sui generis in the virtual environment. And so if we pay attention to that best practices in one arena, they're likely to translate into another arena in some way.
Yeah, I think an interesting point is going completely to the opposite end of the spectrum. If you look at some of the open source development communities, for example, I mean, again, there typically will be some kind of governance structure, and it looks a little bit like a reviewing process and to determine which code goes in and doesn't go in. But these will be very large-scale communities developing very significant pieces of technology, and they'll never talk face-to-face. So again, you have this spectrum, and of course, computer scientists or developers who are doing this kind of thing are a special breed, and so it fits in kind of with their social model, I would suspect.
But the open source is a perfect example of how you can really use that a certain structure to give people credit and build on that. Give credit on the gift economy and the reputation, and I think that we can learn a lot from that.
Yeah, and it's also interesting in the way, I mean, it goes back, in some sense, the community looks a lot more like what you're saying, which is basically if you disagree, you branch the code, you do your own version, and if enough people follow you, then that becomes the one everyone uses. And so it's very chaotic, and there's very kind of loose control structures on it. So there is, a limited amount of policy and governance that goes onto it, and then it's a completely virtual activity and develop non-trivial things.
Mm-hmm. Any questions out there? Yes.
I saw one issue bubbling up, and I suspect it'll bubble further today, and that's the question of opinion brokers and their role within collaborative activities. And a specific question for Catherine. In collaborative review of the sort you've described, how does the role of the editor change? Does the editor, in some sense, become, I'll say, more powerful in having to sort of sort through all the different types of input, or less powerful?
So we've done it once, and we're trying it a second time next year. So I'll have a better answer once we've done it the second time. In my experience, the ends of the process were very similar, and that was by design. So the editors screened up front, as we always do in Shakespeare Quarterly, and the journal editor, David Schkalwick, made the publication decision, as he always does. And it was in the middle part of the process, the role of the editor changed significantly in the sense that my role was to curate the community, right? To bring in, to ensure that we had a critical mass of scholars. I guess that's the same role that I would have had in the traditional process, only I would have only had 2 people to wrangle, as opposed to, say, 30 or 40. And my role was also to think very systematically in advance about what might change. My central concern which wouldn't have been a concern of the traditional process, was how to keep this respectful, so that whatever the outcome, the participants in the process felt as if it was both rigorous and respectful. And that's not a concern an editor has to think about all that much. And when one thinks about how one's letters to contributors might sound. But in this case, I was ensuring a system's respectfulness, and that was a significant challenge.
But in the decision process, you say there's however it came out, you were trying to facilitate a good process, but who determined the outcome?
Well, in this case, the decision was made by the journal editor, and that was clear up front. We came up with a hybrid process that looked the same at the beginning and end, and looked different at the phase of sending essays out for vetting. It was different. The editor's role was different in that we felt we could be accountable to the field, the group of scholars who'd announced themselves as caring about Shakespearean media history, in a way that I don't think one feels one really can be when you have two external reviewers, just those two data points. You know you're being accountable to a certain kind of accredited rigor with those two reviewers. When you have a group of reviewers coming in to say, here's what matters in the field, we're noting a fracture of methodology. And then the editor's decision is, the publication decision is based on thinking about how significant the methodological shift might be. One does face that kind of decision sometimes when one gets a single essay and two reviewers. In my experience, the process itself was less methodologically conservative, with a group of reviewers to look at, to watch their responses. In other words, we were a little bit more open to taking risks as editors, maybe. I'd have to ask the rest of them and see if they felt like that, because we had so many data points to look at. So this issue of the journal goes into methodological territory that the journal never has gone, I think. I've only been on the editorial board for 4 years now. Do you think that's fair, Bruce? That it's methodologically more ranging than the journal has been in the past, this issue?
Oh, yes. I was on the editorial board of the journal for a 15-year period, 5 years before I was on the editorial board of the journal 15 years, 5 years before Catherine joined the journal. And it really was an in-house group of people at the Folger Shakespeare Library read the submissions and immediately eliminated about 90% of them. And then the 10% that were deemed possible were then sent out to two reviewers, and then the editor made the final decision. And what this process opened up was the possibility of acknowledging a wide range of opinions and to be able to acknowledge internal contradictions and what is going on in the field. So I would say that the editor's decision, even though it was finally David's decision, was much better informed than if only two people had read the article.
Certainly, we saw our role as being obliged to take some risks. In other words, trying a new process in peer review, which I think most academics see as one of the foundations of our disciplines, and we tend to be very risk-averse about. One of the things that was different was that we understood ourselves to be deliberately experimenting and therefore deliberately tolerating some sense of riskiness. I don't know if we're answering your question.
It's such a wonderful position to be in when you're experimenting and telling everyone that you're doing that too, setting the expectations. So
we had to over-communicate a lot.
I think we have a few more questions. Robbie over here.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm Robbie Brinton from the Health Science Campus, and Neil, as you might imagine, this is for you and for Carl. I think one of the powerful aspects of ADNEY is the development of veracity and the aspect of migration. And what's been interesting is to go through the ADNEY publications and to see how, now, not everyone's looking at the same problem or the same question, but the consistency of findings. So you take that data set, and you are obviously concerned about the problems with, inconsistency. But what I think is very powerful is the development of this understanding and that is from multiple investigators looking at the same data set, and then emerging from that a consistent type of understanding and response. For example, in the white matter changes.
Yeah, no, it's been very interesting. As of about 2 months ago, there were over 150 publications that have come out of ADNEY, and they're from various sources. I mean, I came across a publication from a group of scientists in China who obviously never collected any of the data, but went into the database, did analyses, and came out. Everybody's looking at the volume of the hippocampus, which is a major area related to memory, and how the hippocampus shrinks over time. And so, as you say, a lot of the data have been extremely consistent by different groups using different methods. So that's been really interesting to see.
So with respect to the second part of migration, right, now I bring in Carl to this, and part of what happened in our CTSI is the collaboration between two of these CTSAs and the suggestion to use the ADNEY protocol for their imaging protocol. But having said that, one of the challenges, I think, with the ADNEY that Carl's group and kind of the informatics analysis is now there is how can we move what is showing up in print to a larger kind of I don't want to use the word media, but a multi-level understanding that goes beyond what is in individual publications. How can we mine that now to actually develop those core concepts, those core knowledge pieces?
I think it's interesting to look at ADNEY and see what happens if you push it, right? So, as I understand it, I mean, ADNEY has a couple of things going for it. So, first of all, you've built a virtual organization, right, where you have this structure and a governance structure and a source of funding that flows to people to actually collect the information. Secondly, all the information actually flows through a single point. It all goes to ART's group, and ART actually does the QC and quality control and pre-processing on the data. And if you go and you read through the protocol, it's very prescriptive about what you do to prepare the data. Now, the good thing that happens is by aggregating and distributing the money across multiple sites, you can get a large size, a better sized data set. And the reason why is because you can't expect all the people with Alzheimer's disease in its various forms to come and go to Art's lab as much as he would love to image everyone. That's not physically possible. Now, the interesting thing that happens is, what if you try to scale that up to the next level, the next form of collaboration, where you're not as centralized and you can't be as prescriptive, and you're going to get more data that's messy and not clean and collected inconsistently, right? So then the interesting collaboration question is how do you deal with that noise and variability, and how do you document the process enough to understand the mode that the data was generated in? So this experiment you mentioned, I think, is quite interesting because we're not actually doing the ADNEY protocol. We're going to do a subset of the ADNEY protocol, and we're going to embed that in clinical visits, not research visits. So it's data that's kind of the same, but not, right? So now the question is, in terms of scientific method and repeatability, how do we keep track of the fact that the data is kind of the same, but it's not. It's different resolution. It's different acquisition protocols. It's not going to go through the same QC. So how do you then incorporate that as part of a collaborative research activity and then still have some kind of veracity of the results that comes out of that? And I think that actually then becomes the really interesting question in terms of, how do you scale this up to global scale?
Can I just follow on that and say that that's one of the things that we don't have good funding for, at least in the humanities. We fund, around technology in the humanities, innovative projects. We don't tend to fund scale-up projects or validation projects or ways to build out and test. And I think that's something that we need to really rethink, because the proof is going to be in the repeatability and the adjustment and the improvement. We also don't tend, at least in the humanities, to think about the process itself as an artifact that should be subject to this kind of validation testing and could be reviewed, could be presented for reappointment.
Right.
Right.
So, and I think that's a really important aspect. So there's some very nice work that's going on in the UK around biomedical analysis that's out of the University of Manchester. And the interesting thing there is they don't share the data set. The artifact is the process. And it's actually process that gets published and reused, in this case in the form of workflows. So they actually publish and curate the process and do reputation around the process and reuse that. So that becomes the kind of the vehicle for sharing knowledge and also for ensuring scientific repeatability. And I think those notions of sharing process and analysis could apply to humanities and social sciences and other areas outside of the scientific methods. So I think there's kind of some core mechanism there that's fairly universal in how one builds collaborations of these types.
Definitely when it comes to innovation, it seems like we have this infatuation with the creating the new and the creativity part, and then we often forget the most important part is scaling it up and making that broader impact. So that's definitely an important point. Yes.
I wonder if to some extent this isn't changing the conception of who the audience is. I mean, in many ways it's a globalizing, in many ways it's a democratizing to some degree. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of what you're saying, Catherine, because, having served, for example, on Film Quarterly, which has at a certain point changed its whole sense of who the audience was going to be, broadening the audience considerably, and therefore changing the whole process of vetting. Because formerly having a live editorial board who thought that they could discuss this and learned in the process, but that they could cover because they were interested in serving an audience that was not necessarily specialist. And as, for example, the Shakespeare Quarterly, the whole notion that you would have this panel of the highest experts who would then radiate this information, distribute this information to others. But now the idea that those who are actually reading the journals are undergoing these transformations because what's happening in the culture. So in some ways it could happen too in the sense of the science, in this like the Chinese people that you referenced. So I wondered if the whole vetting process doesn't really need to take into account, this whole notion of the changes in the ultimate audience.
I think one thing to think about is as you're going through this vetting process, I mean, this is related, that the editorial process and the reviews are actually what we refer to in science, metadata. That's important, and you might want to do meta-analysis on that and critiques of the critiques. And to start viewing that as actually part of the artifact that's produced by the scholarly activity. And so it really does, in that sense, maybe fundamentally change the way you think about this.
Catherine, you had some thoughts on who was involved in the process and the non-traditional roles, folks, students, et cetera.
Well, we had fantasized that a public process would bring in undergraduates and graduate students, and they would comment on senior scholars' work. And what we hadn't recognized is when we did away with anonymity, we also did away with a kind of protection. So there was a wonderful illuminating translation effect. Kate Hales talks about this as a media translation effect, where you begin to know what your core values and assumptions are once you've translated something. Often they're unarticulated. So as we established that this wouldn't be anonymous, in order to provide for some protections for junior scholars, we also effectively moved them out to the extent that very few felt they could socially participate and comment on senior scholars' comments in the field. That there were exceptions to this, but we had fantasized huge demographic shifts, or I had anyways, and they didn't occur. And now that simply means that this process is not a lot more, a hybrid peer review process is not a lot more open to junior scholars than the traditional peer review process is. But we didn't know that until we understood what it meant to do away with anonymity in a fuller sense.
Thank you. Before we close, let me take one more question in the back. There's somebody. Oh, okay.
Actually, I think this may be a bridge to the next topic even. because something that Catherine said at one point referred to the print version. And I think one of the aspects of this which hasn't been addressed and sort of along the lines that are progressing is when you move to online publishing, you move away from the economy of scarcity, which requires you to toss 90% of the articles out on the top simply because you know you don't have the pages, you don't have the space, and what you accept will be published in a year or two. And I think increasingly we have been, across the different disciplines, moving to online publishing, which neither has an economy of scarcity nor a time lag, so that you can engage in ongoing scholarship in a much more active way, but you can also experiment. Once you're no longer limited by a publisher saying you have this many pages and you have to have everything done by this date, you can have a variety of contributions, collaborative discussions and other things online. You can begin to introduce something of an interactive discussion into scholarly publication rather than segregating them, and that does open the conversation as well. In addition, picking up on Marcia's point, when you're online, particularly if you're online and free, you reach audiences around the world who never would have been likely to have access to libraries or to print journals and can enter the conversation in quite unpredictable ways. So I think it's a very obvious next step along here, and I assume today it'll come up in other discussions.
Could we have Dimitri in the back with your question? Yeah.
Oh yeah, this is I'm Dimitri Williams from the Annenberg School. I want to make a comment about smaller scale stuff. The things you do, I think perhaps on the junior side in this room. It's a gentle way of putting it. You guys are way far advanced. You have more zeros in your grants. You're doing things at massive scales, which I find awe-inspiring and a little intimidating. I run a relatively small research team of about 25 people, which I thought was big until today. And the challenges we face in using these tools are substantially different. I have an interdisciplinary team of people at 4 universities, people at lots of different levels, and we have to coordinate and get group coherence. And what we found that's worked very well for us is a combination of sharing tools and meetings, both teleconference, which you alluded to, and face-to-face stuff. And we found a nice mix where our group has learned to coordinate and has become quite productive. Our entire group meets every 2 weeks by teleconference all around the country, and then twice a year in person. And in the meantime, we're sharing data sets and we're using some pretty simple and very cheap technologies. Google's documents have been really very, very process changing for us because nobody owns the thing. The group owns the thing, and it's living and dynamic, and you're not daisy chaining a document around the people. This is an immense change for us, as simple as it sounds. And screen sharing technologies, just the simple idea that everybody's looking at the same web screen as we talk. Those 2 things alone have probably, doubled our productivity over what we would have done in the past. And it's just been it's been a great experience.
I'll just add, we're a very small shop, Shakespeare Quarterly. We couldn't afford to, we don't publish online. I mean, we don't have the resources to do that, and we have a very stable and successful relationship with Johns Hopkins University Press. But what our experience was exactly like that the capacity to be able to be looking at the same space while talking on the telephone, essentially. The telephone was probably the technology that mattered most in this experiment, along with the media commons environment that allowed us to be in the same space talking about the same document,
right,
although sometimes distributed over time as well as space. And it's a very cheap solution. It's an open source solution.
Yeah.
Well, I wish we could have innovated more time, but we don't. Clearly, there's a real opportunity. We're just at the edge of a huge change, and I'm wondering if each one of you, if we have time, just one sentence on a piece of advice or closing thought to everybody here in the room, maybe starting with Neil.
Actually, just thinking about the idea of more data sharing. I mean, it's still something in terms of the culture that's getting going, but don't keep the data all to yourself. Get it out there, let people see it, let people analyze the data. And I think that really advances science, and it helps you as well.
I'd say think about hybrid processes, that when you experiment with some new tool, it doesn't mean you're abandoning the things you care about. It means you're understanding better what it is that you care about, and you need to adapt the tool to those values.
I guess I would say the thing that you see so much is people thinking they're only generating their data for themselves, and they'll do a one-off, and that it's okay to have something sitting in the corner that nobody can get to, and that it's important to think about a mashup culture where your data gets mashed up with somebody else's data, and you end up discovering something new that you had no idea you were going to use it for, and to think about that up front.
Thank you so much for your time, for being here.